After proposing to Ella, he expects cake tastings and playlists, not a mother intent on staging perfection. When she pushes a vow renewal for golden boy Nathan into their wedding, he draws a hard line: now loyalty, love, and his future hinge on whether he can hold it. When I proposed to Ella, I believed the hardest part of wedding planning would be choosing a suit or deciding between a live band and a DJ. I did not imagine the real struggle would come from my parents and their version of family loyalty. My mother believes that a family must look perfect no matter what happens underneath the surface. She worries more about what the neighbors might think than how anyone actually feels. So when Ella and I announced our engagement, I expected opinions, but I never guessed how far she would go. First, everything seemed fine. My father raised a glass of wine at dinner and said he was proud to see his youngest son settling down. He rarely says things like that, so it caught me off guard. My mother smiled in her careful way and told Ella that she was thrilled to help with the wedding. Ella accepted the offer because she is kind and patient. She did not know that in my family, help always comes with strings you do not see until they tighten. In the months that followed, the wedding became less about us and more about my parents. My older brother Nathan appeared in every discussion as if he were the one getting married. My mother has always adored him. He was the golden child in school, the one with perfect grades and trophies. Now he is an architect with a big house and 2 children. I have a small apartment and a modest design job. The difference never bothered me until the planning began, and I saw how she measured everything by Nathan's life. One Sunday we had lunch at my parents' house. My mother cooked roasted chicken and poured too much wine for everyone. As she described Nathan's wedding from years ago, she spoke as if it had been a royal event. She recalled the cathedral, the flowers, the 5-course meal. Ella squeezed my hand under the table because she sensed what was coming. After dessert, my mother sighed and said that Nathan and his wife were having a hard time. She said our wedding could remind them what love looks like. She called it a healing opportunity. I nodded, but inside I felt uneasy. A few days later, Nathan called me. He rarely calls unless he wants something. He asked how the plans were going and then said that he and his wife wanted to renew their vows during our wedding weekend. He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I thought he was joking, but he said Mom had suggested it. I hung up in disbelief. When I told Ella, she stared at me like she thought I was making it up. She had spent weeks choosing colors and decorations. Now my brother wanted to turn our day into a backdrop for his own ceremony. I tried to laugh, but it did not feel funny. I hoped my parents would see reason. They did not. The next evening my mother called and said we should consider letting Nathan have a short vow renewal before the dancing began. She said it would be romantic to have 2 brothers celebrating love together. I told her absolutely not. She sounded shocked and said I was being selfish. She hung up before I could explain. The following day my father called. He said Mom was hurt and that I should think of the bigger picture. He talked about family unity and being the mature one. I wanted to ask why being mature always meant doing what they wanted, but I stayed quiet. That night Ella and I sat on the couch surrounded by invitations. She asked if we were making a mistake by standing firm. I said no, but I was not sure I believed it. The pressure from my parents felt heavier with each call. A week later I went to their house hoping to calm things down. Instead I walked into something worse. My mother was in the living room with fabric samples and paperwork spread across the table. She told me she had already contacted the event coordinator about adding Nathan's renewal as a surprise. My stomach turned. She acted as if she had done something generous. I told her if she went through with it, we would cancel the wedding. She looked at me as if I had lost my mind and said that would be a terrible mistake. I left the house shaking. I drove without direction until I reached a quiet park. I sat there watching the light fade behind the trees. My parents had taken what was supposed to be our happiest moment and turned it into a battleground. For the first time I wondered if the wedding was even worth it. If they could not respect a simple boundary, how could I expect them to respect anything that came after? The sun disappeared and the air grew cold. I realized my mother was not going to let this go. The question was how far she would go to make it happen, and how far I would have to go to stop her. The next morning began quietly, but there was a heaviness in the air that I could not shake. Ella was at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee staring at her phone. She said my mother had texted again. The message was polite on the surface yet full of pressure between the lines. It said that she hoped I would not make any rash decisions, and that Nathan's vow renewal was already becoming a family expectation. Ella handed me the phone and asked if this was the kind of marriage I wanted to build with family interference at every turn. I told her no, but deep down I felt the familiar pull of guilt that comes from years of trying to please people who will never be satisfied. That day at work I could barely focus. My screen blurred in front of me as I kept replaying the conversation at my parents' house. I knew that if I gave in this time, there would always be another demand waiting right behind it. The pattern was old. It began when I was a kid and learned that peace in our home only existed when I agreed with them. Nathan never had to agree with anyone. He was born with an invisible crown on his head, and somehow it still shines no matter what he does. I kept thinking that maybe if I stayed silent long enough, my parents would eventually see reason. They never did in the past, but part of me always hoped they might change. When I got home that evening, Ella was in the living room surrounded by wedding binders and notes. She looked exhausted. She said the venue coordinator had called to ask about the supposed vow renewal edition. My mother had contacted her again during the day. Ella told the coordinator to ignore any request that did not come directly from us. Her calm tone barely hid her frustration. She asked how long I planned to let my mother run the show. I wanted to say I was handling it, but the truth was I was losing control faster than I could rebuild it. That night, I decided to call my mother again. I told myself I would be firm yet respectful. When she answered, she sounded cheerful, as if everything between us was fine. I told her I needed her to stop contacting vendors and to cancel any changes she had made. There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breathing. Then she said she was only doing what she thought was best for the family. I told her this wedding was not about the family. It was about Ella and me. She said that sounded selfish. I said maybe it was, but it was also honest. The silence stretched until she finally said she would back off, though her tone made it clear she did not mean it. 2 days passed before the next wave hit. My father called during lunch and said that Nathan had been hurt by my reaction. He said I had embarrassed him and that I should apologize for overreacting. I wanted to laugh. Nathan was the one trying to hijack our day, yet somehow I was the villain. My father talked about the importance of keeping family close. I asked him if that meant letting them walk over me. He did not answer directly. He said that my mother was upset again and that it would mean a lot if I came to dinner that weekend to talk things through. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When Saturday arrived, Ella chose not to come. She said she needed a break from the tension. I could not blame her. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual. When I pulled into the driveway, my brother's car was already there. The moment I stepped inside, I knew the dinner had been planned as an ambush. My parents were seated together at the table, and Nathan stood by the window with his arms crossed. My mother smiled in that tight way that always hides disappointment. She said she was glad I came because she wanted us to clear the air. I told her I was only there to set boundaries, not to argue. She nodded, but her eyes drifted toward Nathan. He began by saying he never meant to upset me. He said he thought combining the events would make things more special. He claimed he was doing it for our parents because they had been worried about the family drifting apart. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. I told him the problem was not about unity. It was about respect. He said I was being dramatic and that no one outside the family would even care if he and his wife said a few words during the reception. My mother chimed in with a soft voice, saying that everyone would find it heartwarming. I told them all again that the answer was no. My father's expression hardened, and he said I was acting like a stranger to my own family. The room went quiet for a long moment. Then my mother stood and said that if I refused to include Nathan, she might not attend the wedding at all. My father nodded in agreement. They both looked at me as if waiting for me to break. I stood there feeling my pulse pound in my ears. I told them I loved them, but I would not change my mind. My mother's face fell, and she turned away, pretending to straighten the tablecloth. My father muttered that he was ashamed of my attitude. Nathan shrugged as if he pitied me. I left without another word. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. I had finally said what needed to be said, but I knew the fallout would not end there. Ella listened quietly as I told her what happened. She said she was proud of me but worried about how far my parents might go next. I told her I could handle it, yet part of me was not sure anymore. The next morning an envelope was waiting in our mailbox. It was from my mother. Inside was a handwritten note that said she loved me and hoped I would still invite them to the wedding even though they would not attend if I insisted on excluding Nathan's renewal. Beneath the note was a check for the exact amount they had contributed to the wedding fund with a message that said it was best to keep finances separate since I had chosen a different path. I stared at the check for a long time. It felt like a line had been drawn that could never be erased. I thought about tearing it up, but Ella placed her hand over mine and told me to keep it as proof. Proof that love in my family had always come with conditions. I folded the note and placed it back in the envelope. The day outside was bright, yet somehow everything inside me felt dim. I had stood my ground, but the cost of that victory was only beginning to show. And deep down I knew my mother's letter was not an ending. It was the start of something far more complicated. For the next week the house felt unusually quiet. Ella worked long hours at the studio and I spent most evenings sitting by the window trying to collect my thoughts. The envelope from my mother still sat on the coffee table untouched. Every time I looked at it I felt a strange mix of pride and grief. It symbolized my first real act of independence from them, yet also the final proof that I had lost something I could never quite replace. I kept wondering how love between parents and children could turn into a transaction so easily. Ella told me she was relieved that we finally had some distance. She said it was better to start our marriage on our own terms rather than bend ourselves to please everyone else. I agreed with her, yet the silence that followed our conversations said otherwise. There was a part of me that missed my family even though they were the ones who had created this mess. I missed Sunday lunches that always ended with my father telling the same stories and my mother handing out leftovers. It was strange how quickly nostalgia can rewrite pain when you are lonely enough. A few days later my phone rang. It was my Aunt Grace. She rarely calls unless something serious is going on. She asked if I had spoken to my parents recently. I told her no. She sighed heavily and said that my mother had been calling relatives to explain that she and my father were not attending the wedding because I had humiliated them. I asked what she meant by humiliated. Grace said that according to my mother I had banned Nathan from the event entirely, which was not true. I told her he was still invited but his vow renewal was not happening. Grace said she believed me but warned that other relatives might not. Apparently my mother had always been skilled at shaping the story to her liking. That evening Ella found me pacing in the living room. I told her what my aunt had said. She looked calm, but I could tell she was angry. She said my mother was trying to turn the family against us so that we would be the ones to apologize first. I said I was done apologizing. Still, the thought of seeing empty chairs where my parents were supposed to sit made my chest tighten. Ella reminded me that the wedding was not a negotiation. It was a celebration of our choice to build a life together free from manipulation. I nodded, though it felt easier said than done. 2 days later, an email arrived from Nathan. The subject line said, "Let's be adults about this." The message was short. He wrote that Mom and Dad were hurt but willing to forgive if I apologized publicly during the rehearsal dinner. He said that would show the family that I respected them. I stared at the screen trying to decide if this was some kind of joke. Ella read it over my shoulder and whispered that he sounded more like a politician than a brother. I deleted the email without replying. The next morning I received another message. This one was from the venue coordinator. She wanted to confirm whether the family choir performance at the end of the ceremony was still happening. I blinked in confusion because I had never arranged any choir. When I asked for details, she said that my mother had called earlier in the week and booked a surprise performance in honor of the entire family's unity. I felt my jaw tighten. My mother had gone around me again, even after promising to stay out of the planning. Ella suggested that we cancel the entire booking and move the wedding elsewhere. She said it might be the only way to escape the interference. I hesitated. We had already paid deposits, and changing the venue so close to the date would cost us more than we could afford. I told her we would confront it directly instead. She looked doubtful but agreed. That evening I called my mother again. She did not pick up, so I left a voicemail saying that if she continued to interfere I would ask security at the venue to remove anyone who caused trouble. I did not want to sound harsh, but at this point I had no other choice. For the first time in my life, I was prepared to enforce consequences rather than beg for peace. The next day my father called. His voice was cold. He said he could not believe I would threaten my own mother. He reminded me that she had spent months helping me plan the wedding, as if that erased the chaos she had created. I told him that love without respect was not help. There was a long pause before he said that if I went through with this I would regret it. Then he hung up. That night I sat on the edge of the bed, unable to sleep. Ella rolled over and asked what was wrong. I told her I was starting to think my parents might actually skip the wedding. She said that maybe that was for the best. I stared at the ceiling, trying to picture the ceremony without them. The thought felt both painful and strangely peaceful. 3 days later, a package arrived at our door. It was a small box wrapped in gold paper with my mother's handwriting on the label. Inside was a folded piece of lace from her wedding dress and a short note that read something borrowed for good luck. I hope you change your mind before it is too late. Ella found me standing at the counter holding the lace in my hands. She asked what it meant. I said I was not sure. Maybe it was her way of reaching out, or maybe another attempt to guilt me into submission. The truth was I could not tell anymore where love ended and control began. That night, I placed the lace back in the box and set it on the shelf. I told myself I would decide later what to do with it. Yet something about the message unsettled me. It felt less like a gift and more like a warning. I went to bed trying to shake off the thought, but could not. My mother was quiet now, but silence in my family never lasted long. Whenever things grew quiet, something else was already forming beneath the surface. I had no idea what it would be this time, but I could feel it coming closer with every passing day. The morning of the rehearsal dawned with a pale light that spread slowly across the window blinds. I had hoped that by then things would have settled, yet the air around me still carried that restless heaviness that had followed us for weeks. Ella moved through the kitchen quietly while I sat on the couch staring at the guest list. Half of the names now made me nervous. Some belonged to relatives who had stopped replying to messages since my mother's calls had reached them. Others were family friends who would arrive expecting smiles and harmony. I kept thinking about how many of those smiles were built on fiction. The rehearsal itself was supposed to be simple. A quick run-through with the coordinator followed by dinner with the wedding party. I arrived early with Ella only to see Nathan already there standing with a few of our cousins. He greeted me with a smile that seemed forced and said that Mom and Dad were still deciding whether to come tomorrow. I nodded without answering. I could tell by the tone of his voice that he knew more than he was letting on. The coordinator began running through the steps. Ella was radiant even under the dull lights of the empty hall. Watching her walk down the aisle during practice should have filled me with joy, but all I could think about was whether my parents would appear uninvited. The coordinator mentioned that the choir had been officially canceled per my instruction, though she had received a call the night before from someone claiming to be my assistant who had tried to reinstate it. I clenched my fists and told her to ignore any future requests unless they came from me directly. She nodded, though I could see curiosity in her eyes. After the run-through, Ella and I went to dinner with our closest friends. For a brief stretch of time, the tension eased. We laughed about small things and talked about our honeymoon plans. When dessert arrived, my phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number, but the tone was familiar. It read, "You may regret turning your back on family. Some lessons come the hard way." I stared at it until Ella asked what was wrong. I told her it was probably a prank, but I felt a chill that I could not explain. The next morning, I decided to drive by my parents' house before heading to the venue. I told myself I just wanted to clear the air once and for all. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, yet the house itself felt different. The curtains were drawn and the front yard looked untended. I knocked, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, the door finally opened and my father appeared. His face looked tired, yet his voice was calm. He said my mother was inside resting and that I should go enjoy my day. He said they would not be attending. His words should have hurt, yet instead I felt an odd sense of relief. I thanked him and walked back to the car without another word. When I returned home, Ella was packing last-minute items for the reception. I told her my parents were not coming. She stopped for a moment, then nodded slowly. She said that maybe this was how it was always meant to be. I wanted to believe that, The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small tasks and nervous laughter. By the time we arrived at the venue, guests were already gathering outside. The hall smelled of fresh flowers and polished wood. For the first time in weeks, the chaos felt distant. Everything went smoothly until the ceremony was about to start. Just as the music began, I noticed movement at the back of the room. My mother walked in dressed in a pale blue gown, her expression unreadable. My father followed behind her. Murmurs rippled through the guests as they took seats near the aisle. I felt my heart pound, but I forced myself to stay still. Ella's eyes met mine, and I saw the same thought cross her face. What now? The ceremony itself went beautifully. Ella's vows were steady and full of quiet grace. Mine came out rougher but honest. When the officiant declared us married and the room filled with applause, I thought maybe the worst was over. For a short while during the reception, it even felt true. My mother approached us during the first dance with a tight smile and congratulated Ella. She barely looked at me, but I took the gesture as a truce. Later in the evening, the coordinator signaled that someone wanted to make an unplanned toast. Before I could stop her, my mother stepped forward holding a microphone. She thanked everyone for coming and spoke about family being a bond that survives every hardship. Then she turned toward Nathan and his wife seated near the front and invited them to stand. The crowd clapped politely as she announced that they would like to renew their vows in honor of love everlasting. I felt the air leave my chest. Ella looked at me with disbelief. I stepped forward and told the coordinator to cut the microphone. The music stopped and the room fell silent. I told everyone that this moment was not on the schedule and that we would continue with the celebration as planned. My mother's face turned pale. She said I was humiliating her in front of everyone. I told her this was my wedding, not hers. The guests shifted uncomfortably as the tension grew. Nathan muttered something under his breath about me being ungrateful and started to walk out. My mother followed him. My father hesitated, then trailed after them. The sound of their departure echoed louder than any song the band could have played. For a moment I just stood there, not sure whether to feel anger or relief. Ella reached for my hand and whispered that it was over. I nodded, yet inside I wondered what over really meant. The rest of the night moved forward with an odd mix of joy and unease. Friends and cousins tried to fill the silence with laughter, but everyone had seen what happened. Still, the dancing continued, and by the time we cut the cake, the tension had softened into a strange kind of peace. When the guests finally left and the lights dimmed, Ella and I stood together near the doorway watching the last of the candles flicker out. She said it felt like we had just walked through a storm. I said maybe that was exactly what marriage begins with. She smiled faintly, but I could see the worry in her eyes. We drove away from the venue under a sky heavy with stars. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was tired. I knew my mother would not let the night end quietly. Whatever came next would arrive soon. And though I did not know it yet, her next move would change everything again. The morning after the wedding, I woke to the soft sound of rain against the window. Ella was still asleep beside me, her hair tangled across the pillow. The world outside felt hushed and gray, like it was holding its breath after what had happened the night before. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how strange it felt to be married at last and yet so unsettled. We had survived the ceremony, the confrontation, the walkout, yet none of it felt finished. My phone sat on the nightstand blinking with new messages, but I could not bring myself to look. When I finally checked it, the first message was from my Aunt Grace. She said she hoped we were resting and that the wedding had been beautiful despite the drama. Then she mentioned that my parents had left early because my mother was unwell. I was about to reply when another notification appeared. It was from Nathan. His message was short. "You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth it." I stared at the words for a long time, trying to decide what to feel. Anger seemed too easy. Sadness too exhausting. All I felt was emptiness. Ella woke and sat beside me quietly. She asked if I had heard from them. I told her yes, but left out the details. She said we should focus on us now that the wedding was behind us. She was right, yet part of me knew the past was not done with us. I promised her I would let it go, but I could tell she did not believe me. We spent the morning packing for our short honeymoon trip to the mountains. It was something simple, a few days in a small cabin far from everything. I thought distance might bring clarity. The drive up was long and winding. The air grew colder with each mile. For the first time in months, no one could reach us by phone. Reception faded until only silence remained. The cabin sat on a ridge surrounded by pine trees that smelled sharp and clean after the rain. Ella seemed lighter there. She smiled more. She cooked while I built a fire. At night we sat wrapped in blankets watching the flames flicker. For a while it felt like life had finally gone quiet. On the third evening I checked my voicemail out of habit when we drove into a small town for groceries. There were several messages waiting. The first few were from friends congratulating us again. The last one was from my father. His voice sounded strained. He said my mother had been taken to the hospital the morning after the wedding. He said she had collapsed at home and that the doctors thought it was exhaustion mixed with stress. He ended the message by saying she was asking for me. I played the recording twice to be sure I had heard it right. Ella stood next to me in the parking lot staring at my face as I replayed the words. She asked what had happened. I told her my mother was in the hospital. Her expression shifted between concern and dread. She said we should go back. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to stay where we were. The drive down the mountain felt endless. By the time we reached the city, night had fallen and the hospital lights glowed cold and sterile. My father met us in the lobby. His face looked older than I remembered. He said my mother was stable but still weak. He added that she wanted to see me alone. Ella touched my arm and whispered that she would wait outside. When I walked into the room, my mother was sitting up against a stack of pillows, pale but alert. She looked at me and smiled faintly. She said she was sorry for how everything turned out. Her voice was soft, almost fragile. I waited, expecting another attempt to justify what she had done, but it never came. She said she had realized during the reception that she could not control everything. That watching me stand my ground had made her see something she had been blind to. I wanted to believe her, yet part of me wondered if this was just another performance. She reached for my hand and said she only wanted me to remember that family is messy, but it is still family. She asked if Ella was outside. I said yes. She nodded and said she hoped we would build something better than what she had built. For the first time I saw her eyes fill with tears that looked real. We talked for a few more minutes before the nurse came in. When I left the room, my father was waiting in the hallway. He said she would be discharged in a day or two. He also said that Nathan was angry but would calm down eventually. I nodded but said nothing. Outside in the parking lot, the night air felt heavy and damp. Ella asked how it went. I told her my mother had apologized. She looked surprised but relieved. We drove home in silence, both of us unsure what came next. The next morning my phone buzzed again. It was a message from my father. It said that my mother was resting at home and that she wanted to see both of us for dinner later in the week. I stared at the message for a long time. Ella asked if I planned to go. I told her I had not decided yet. Part of me wanted peace. Another part feared that peace in my family always came with a cost. I looked at the wedding band on my hand and thought about everything we had already endured. Maybe this dinner would finally close the chapter. Or maybe it would open another one entirely. Either way, I knew I would have to face it. Because with my family, nothing ever truly ended. It only shifted shape until it found another way back. The week passed in slow, uneven stretches, as if time itself was unsure what to do with us. Ella went back to work at the studio while I tried to focus on my freelance projects, though my thoughts kept circling around the dinner invitation. I told myself it was only a meal, a polite gesture after the hospital scare, yet something about it felt heavier than that. My father's text had been formal, like a message sent to a business contact rather than his own son. My mother had said nothing since our brief talk at the hospital. The silence made me restless. When Thursday arrived, I told Ella that we should go. She hesitated but agreed. She said it might help to end the tension before it followed us into the rest of our lives. On the drive over, the sky hung low and gray. It had rained earlier and the roads glistened in the fading light. We barely spoke. When we pulled into the driveway, my father's car was already there, and another one I did not recognize. I asked if she wanted to stay in the car, but she shook her head and said we should face it together. Inside the house, the smell of baked bread and something sweet filled the air. My mother greeted us with a faint smile and hugged Ella first. It surprised me more than anything else that evening. My father appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray of glasses. He said they were happy we came. His tone sounded rehearsed but gentle. We sat in the dining room where the table was set with candles and polished silverware. Everything looked almost too perfect. For the first few minutes conversation stayed light. My mother asked about the honeymoon and Ella told her about the mountain cabin. She listened quietly and nodded as if trying to memorize every word. My father spoke about Nathan's kids and how busy his firm had become. I waited for the moment when politeness would peel away and reveal what we were really there to discuss. It came halfway through dinner when my mother set down her fork and looked directly at me. She said she had spent the past week thinking about what happened at the wedding. She admitted she had gone too far. Then she paused and added that while she was wrong to interfere, she hoped I could understand that everything she did came from fear, not malice. Fear of losing her family. Fear of seeing her sons drift apart. I listened without interrupting. Her words sounded rehearsed yet not entirely empty. She said the hospital had given her too much time to think, and she realized that control is a poor substitute for love. I told her that I appreciated the apology, but it would take time to rebuild trust. She nodded and said she expected that. For the first time in months, the air in the room felt still instead of sharp. My father raised his glass and said that maybe this was the start of a new chapter. Ella smiled politely, but I could see the uncertainty behind her eyes. She had learned the same lesson I had. Peace in this family often came wearing borrowed clothes. After dessert, my mother asked me to help her carry some dishes to the kitchen. When we were alone, she opened a drawer and took out the small box she had sent after the wedding. Inside was the folded piece of lace from her dress. She handed it to me again and said she wanted Ella to keep it. She said it belonged to someone who had survived too many storms and that maybe it would bring better luck to the next generation. I took it and thanked her. Before we left, my father walked us to the door. He said that Nathan still felt wounded but would come around. He asked if we would consider inviting him and his family for dinner sometime. I said maybe later when things felt less raw. He accepted that answer with a slow nod. As we stepped outside, the night air smelled faintly of rain and garden soil. Ella slipped her hand into mine. On the drive home, she said she wanted to believe my mother's apology was real. I said I wanted to believe it too. We talked about small things for a while, then fell quiet as the city lights slid past the windows. When we reached our apartment, she asked if I felt better. I told her yes, but the truth was more complicated. That night, I placed the lace on our dresser beside the wedding photo. I stared at it for a long time. It looked delicate yet strong, as if it had endured more than it should have. I thought about my mother in that hospital bed whispering that family is messy, but it is still family. I wondered if she truly meant it or if it was another line from a play she could not stop performing. Over the next few days, messages began arriving from relatives who had heard about her apology dinner. Some congratulated us for making peace. Others hinted that they hoped Nathan and I would follow suit. It was strange how quickly stories traveled in our family. One small dinner and suddenly we were being cast as symbols of forgiveness. One afternoon, Ella found me sitting at the table reading through those messages. She asked what I was thinking. I told her I was thinking about how much energy it takes to keep a family together and how easily that energy can turn destructive. She said maybe that was why we needed to build our own version of family from scratch. I liked the sound of that. Still, a part of me could not shake the feeling that something was unfinished. The apology felt genuine yet incomplete, as if another truth waited beneath it. My mother's eyes during dinner had carried a kind of sadness I had never seen before. Not guilt but worry. 2 nights later, my phone rang just after midnight. It was Nathan. I hesitated before answering. His voice was low and tired. He said we needed to talk. I asked if it could wait until morning. He said no because it concerned Mom. My heart sank as I listened. He said she had called him earlier that night in tears. She had confessed something to him that he did not know how to handle, and he thought I deserved to hear it too. I asked what she had said. He hesitated before replying. When he finally spoke, his words came slow and heavy. He said she had admitted that the hospital incident was not just exhaustion. It was something else. Something she had been hiding from everyone. He paused again and said she had been diagnosed months earlier with a heart condition that was far more serious than she had let on. She had kept it secret because she did not want to worry anyone or ruin the wedding. The line went quiet for a moment as I tried to process it. Nathan said he did not know what to do. He said she was refusing treatment beyond the basics and was insisting that the family stay calm. He asked if I could talk to her. I said I would. When I hung up, Ella was already awake watching me from the bed. I told her what Nathan had said. She reached for my hand and said maybe this was the real reason behind everything my mother had done. I sat there in the dark trying to understand it. For months I had been fighting to keep my mother out of my life. Now it seemed I might have to fight to keep her in it. The following morning sunlight crept through the curtains in thin pale lines that barely reached the floor. I had not slept much after the call with Nathan. My mind kept running in tight circles, replaying every conversation with my mother through a new lens. The control, the guilt, the sudden collapse, the quiet sadness in her eyes during dinner. It all fit together in a way I wished it did not. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the untouched cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Ella joined me and said we should go see her. I nodded without a word because I already knew we would. The drive to my parents' house felt heavier than any drive before it. The same streets I had known my whole life looked sharper, somehow like they were trying to warn me of what was coming. When we pulled into the driveway, my father was trimming the hedges, though his movements were slow and distracted. He looked up when he saw us, and his expression softened with quiet relief. He said Mom was inside resting but would be happy to see us. Inside the house, the smell of bread and lavender filled the air again, yet this time it felt almost like an echo of that dinner a few nights earlier. My mother sat in her favorite armchair near the window wrapped in a light shawl. She smiled when she saw us, though I could see the tiredness behind it. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for mine. I tried to keep my own voice steady as I asked how she was feeling. She said she was fine, but her tone betrayed her. I told her I knew about the diagnosis. She looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. She said she had not meant to hide it forever. She just wanted to give me a chance to be happy on my wedding day without carrying her burden. She said she had been living with the condition quietly for a while, and that the doctors had warned her about stress, but she had ignored them. She said the collapse after the wedding had frightened her, but also forced her to see that she could not keep pretending. Her words came out steady, but there was a tremor beneath them. I sat beside her and listened. She said she knew she had done damage and that she was not asking for forgiveness but for understanding. She wanted me to know that her obsession with control had always come from fear, not pride. Fear that her family would crumble without her holding the pieces together. Fear that her sons would drift apart the way her own siblings had after their parents died. She said she had spent her life trying to prevent history from repeating itself, and in doing so she had created her own version of it. I told her that what I wanted was not perfection but honesty. I said I could handle the truth even if it hurt, but I could not handle the half-truths and manipulations anymore. She nodded and said she understood. Then she asked me to promise one thing. She said that no matter what happens, I should not let bitterness define our family after she is gone. She said families survive only when someone decides to be kinder than they have to be. I promised, though my voice caught halfway through the words. When we left the house, Ella was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said that maybe this was the closure we needed. I said I was not sure closure was the right word. It felt more like a slow acceptance that things would never be simple. We drove home without music, just the sound of the tires humming against the road. Over the next few weeks, we visited my parents often. Nathan came too, and though our conversations were awkward at first, they began to soften. We would sit around the table sharing stories that once would have ended in arguments but now ended in small smiles. My mother seemed weaker each time, yet lighter somehow, as if a weight she had carried for years was finally fading. She started keeping a small notebook beside her chair, where she wrote down family recipes and short notes about memories she wanted us to keep. She said it helped her sleep better. One afternoon, while Ella and I were visiting, she handed the notebook to me. She said she wanted me to have it because I was the one who understood how fragile peace can be and how much work it takes to keep it alive. She said family is like a table that will always wobble a little no matter how many times you fix it. What matters is that you keep setting it anyway. I did not know what to say, so I just held her hand. Months later, after the worst of the tension had settled, my mother's health stabilized enough for her to move around again. The doctors said the medication was helping and that with care she could still live many good years. Hearing that felt like being given time we did not deserve. Nathan and I started talking regularly again. It was not perfect, but it was something. Sometimes that is all you get. Ella and I began building our life quietly in our small apartment. The noise of family drama faded into the background, replaced by the ordinary rhythm of married life. Work mornings, coffee evenings that passed in gentle silence. Every now and then I would glance at the piece of lace resting inside a small glass frame on our dresser. It looked fragile yet strong, just like the woman who gave it to me. One night, I found myself sitting at the table with my mother's notebook open. I read one of her lines again and again. Love is not peace. It is the decision to stay when peace feels impossible. I thought about everything we had been through and realized she had been right all along in her own flawed way. In the end, I learned that families do not break in a single moment. They crack slowly until someone decides to stop pushing and starts holding the pieces together. Maybe that was what she had been trying to teach us all along, though she had gone about it the wrong way. I closed the notebook and looked toward the window where the city lights shimmered faintly in the distance. For the first time in a long while I felt something close to peace. Not the perfect kind that never breaks, but the kind that breathes quietly beneath all the noise. And as I sat there, I realized that maybe this was what growing up finally meant. Not winning the argument. Not proving anyone wrong. Just choosing to love people anyway.